When I think of a man's emotion, I imagine the ocean and how on the surface it might appear to be calm and blue, but underneath there's a lot going on. Let's just say on the surface, pretend everything is okay, pretend that we're strong, but really that's not what's happening.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Below the Surface. I'm your host, Kudakwashim Shaike. I get really excited just coming to talk to you on this podcast. There's a lot that has happened in my life in the past couple years that has gotten me to this place. And I'm just so excited to share some of the knowledge and wisdom that I've gained over the years. Last week, we were talking a lot about vulnerability and why, as an organization, we stand for vulnerability, and why, last year we had to take a break in the summer just to think about how were we going to convince people that were already not convinced that vulnerability was the most powerful thing if applied right, and also why we were celebrating it in the first place and why we're creating spaces for vulnerability. And out of that conversation came the idea of like how vulnerability allows for freedom. As an organization, repeating this fact again, we stand for freedom. And we define freedom loosely as being allowed that a space and an opportunity to be vulnerable and authentic. But we left it there. We left it at just, we gave the reason for vulnerability and what vulnerability allows as authenticism as one of the reasons why we should pursue vulnerability. And we gave another reason as freedom, but we never got deeper into actually understanding what does it mean to find your authentic self. And I think one of the fundamental things about being authentic, and I think, it gets thrown around a lot, of the idea of like, just be authentic, just be your real self. And people have, looked for examples of like, what does that look like? But I think the fundamental thing about being your authentic self and showing up in that and being vulnerable enough to be authentic rests on the idea of values, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today. So today we're talking about values, and we're going to talk about three main things about values. We're going to talk about why do they matter, why values. And the second thing that we're going to cover is how do they relate back to what Below the Surface stands for as an organization and also as a podcast, which is vulnerability. How do those connect together, and how does that connect back to being authentic? And the last thing that we're going to cover is like, how do we even achieve and how do we even find ways to look at those values? What do they even mean, and how do they look on a daily? I think it's just a term that's been thrown around a lot of like, are you within your values? Are you living according to your values? What are your values? And I think people get confused on what this actually even means. So don't worry. We're going to talk about it today, and it's going to be very clear on what this means. And my hope by the end of this podcast, by the end of you listening to this, that you have an idea and an understanding of like how values show up in your life. I think that we all have values. Not only think, but it's true. We all have values. Like the people listening to right now, you, your friends, your family, everybody they have values. But what differentiates us, though, is that do we know what those values are? Not only that, but are we living according to them? And if we're living according to them, how often are we living according to them? But before we get into that, I want to loosely define what values are. The Oxford Dictionary defines values as principles or guidelines in which we find important. Like I define them as the things that we think are most important in this life. It's the things that we have set to be important for ourselves. So to explain this is that, for example, to put it into context, one of my biggest values is honesty. I value honesty. I value honesty at work. I value honesty at home. I think people get confused. They think that values are things that, if you ask people, what are your values at work, they'll say, oh, do you mean my values at work or my values at home? But actually, the funny thing is like your values apply everywhere. We have the same set of values in every given space. The problem then happens when the values that we have don't align with the values that our friends or our coworkers or organizations that we work for stand for. So it then becomes very important for us to be very clear on what those values are for ourselves, so that when we show up in those spaces, when those values don't align, it's very clear. And also we can be given an opportunity to make a choice to be either courageous and take on and represent our values, or fall for what the organization or what other people around us believe and stand for, which is something that I hopefully by the end of the podcast, you see why it's not a good idea to do. So now that we've defined what values are, to repeat that again, values are things that we stand for, things that we believe in. They're guidelines. They're ways that I like to think of them almost as a map. So if you're going from place A to B, you need a way to get there, right? And you need reminders, things that are going to tell you, oh, now you turn left, now you turn right. Those are essentially what values are. It's a compass that you have that tells you at any given point as you're moving on your journey where you should be making your turns, whether you should be going left or right, if they're being used correctly and rightfully. But like any good compass, any good compass out there, a compass only works if, first of all, it's being used and it's being recognized to exist, and it's being actually followed. So one of the main things that I said I wanted to address is why values, right? And it's essentially because of that, because without recognizing that we do have values, we're controlled by everything else that's outside of our values. And what ends up happening is that when we don't live according to our values, we cause a lot of pain on ourselves. A lot of shame comes from not living according to our values. A lot of pain, a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety comes from not living according to our values. I'll give you an example. Like I said, one of my values is honesty. So every time that I tell a lie or that I don't tell people the truth, I find myself going through a really hard time internally because I was not honest with people around me. And as a result, I've given up on trying to lie. I actually lead by honesty everywhere that I go, even in my workplace. I'm always trying to be honest. It's not because I'm quote unquote, even though it ends up being that, and I'm happy it ends up being that, it ends up being a positive impact on other people. What I'm really seeking there is not to please other people, but it is to please that essence of mine that gets hurt every time I tell a lie. So that's the nice thing about values too, though. They're really nice in the way that when we live according to them, they always make a positive impact on the people around us. And when we live according to them, they make us happy, but also they make the community and everybody happy. They're usually positive things that we have decided are the best way to live according to. So that's the answer of why values. Why should we even care about understanding what these values are? Why should we even care about living according to them? Because there is no other way. It's like going from place A to B without having a map or a compass. You're definitely going to get lost, and it's going to cause a lot of pain. So that's why we ascribe to values in the first place. But the second point that I wanted to share was how do they connect to the mission of the work that we're doing right now, and why is it important to me right now sitting to you talking about values? I think it's very important to us because like we talked about last week as we're coming back and bring alive again the podcast, the main thing for us has been we want to celebrate freedom. We want to create freedom for everybody who listens to this podcast, for men especially, because this is a podcast for men. We're promoting freedom. Essentially, it's the idea of freedom found through vulnerability, freedom found through authenticity, freedom found through us finding our best possible selves and living according to that. And there's no best possible self without values. And so that's how it connects to the mission of the work that we're doing. And that's how it connects to authentic self. Because the idea of an authentic self, when we say authentic, right, we're saying this is the OG, this is the real thing. But what we're comparing, when we say the real thing, it means when we compare two things, we can say this is the counterfeit and this is the real thing, right? There needs to be a form of comparison. There needs to be a thing that we're comparing to, and that is our values. When we say this person is authentic, we mean that given the values that they have said they live according to, they're showing up in every space, whether it's work, whether it's home, according to those values. Hence, they're authentic, they're real, they're OG to the things that they've said are very important to them. So that's how then our values connect back to us being authentic. And it connects now back to vulnerability in that, like, when we are vulnerable, we cannot be authentic without vulnerability. Vulnerability is essentially showing up as we are, as we are. That is according to our values that we've set ourselves to be. For example, for me, like I said again, at work, I try to be honest. That is me showing up, being vulnerable. In moments where the organization may benefit the organization for me to lie, I'm not lying. I'm telling the truth. And I'm going against the grain in that way. I'm being vulnerable, not knowing how things would turn out for me. So that's how it connects back to vulnerability and authenticity, which is something that we're trying to celebrate and create space for. And the last thing is that I also wanted to share briefly. I'm going to make a complete podcast about living according to values because this topic is so broad, but I just wanted to give a filler for you all to understand the whole idea of values and why it matters in the first place and why we should be concerned when we're not living according to values or when we don't understand what our values are. So the last point I wanted to identify, how does that even look like in our daily lives, and how do we even know, and how do we begin that journey to understand what our values are? I think it ties back to the thing that I just said, which is identifying areas in your life where you find a lot of anxiety, identifying areas in your life where you find a lot of shame and pain and fear. Those are usually closely related to us not living according to our values. When we find ourselves shameful most of the time, it's because we haven't been living according to the things that we know we should be doing or we know are important to us. And sometimes we don't, because we don't pay so much attention. We may not even understand that these things are fundamental to us, which is now it becomes very important for us to understand where these things exist and how they exist so we can address them. But another place where we could also find and see our values, I'm going to start with the negative side, right? Like the negative side where we've not been living according to values and how that could show up and how we could use that to actually understand our values. And then I'm going to say the positive side where we are actually living according to them and how we could see that we're living according to them. The other thing on the negative side is that when we find ourselves judging other people quite strongly, it's funny, like judgment is very attached closely to values. When you find ourselves, you look at someone and you're like being judgmental of like their actions, or like, I can't believe that person lied. I can't believe this person did this thing. I can't believe that they cheated on their girlfriend. The reason why it makes you that mad and that upset that the world is in any way doing anything you don't approve of is because you value that thing. You value, maybe it could be honesty, you value friendship in places where people are not being friendly. Maybe you value honesty, you value trust when trust is being broken. So whenever you find yourself upset at something, at a system, at an organization, at how things are moving, maybe they're slow, maybe they're too fast, it means there's a value system you have that's being broken. And it's a moment for you to step back and analyze and understand it so that you can uphold that value, so that you can live according to that value. And in a way, you don't carry as much shame or as much judgment as you do of that thing. It's a great opportunity. For me, I've actually learned a lot of my values through the things that make me angry. like for example, justice. The justice system in America makes me very upset. When I read the stories, it's become very clear to me that I really value justice. And it's actually something that has enabled me to even do this work. Part of me doing this work is because I value people having the knowledge, people having the wisdom that I have, and sharing that wisdom so for a just and fair society. Because of that value, because of what I've experienced, it showed me exactly where my pain points are, and I reeled it back into my mission. But I wouldn't have been able to do this if I was not very clear on those values. So more on the positive side, I think our values are ingrained in moments where we can remember feeling a lot of joy. So I think it's important to step back sometimes and think of moments where you've been the most joyful, where you've been the most peaceful, and also actually, and quite strangely, where it's been very difficult for you to make a decision. Actually, Brené Brown talks about and I found this to be true, in moments where we feel very tired. It means that we've been spending time trying to live according to our values. Because I think we think that it's supposed to just be a journey of excitement and fun. But living according to our values is actually pretty hard and pretty tiresome. And so in moments where you found yourself, though, like feeling this sense of peace, though that could be followed sometimes with a sense of tiredness and with a sense of of internal conflict, those are moments where we're being challenged. Those are moments where we're being put forward, our values are put against values of other people that we may not agree with. So those are fundamental moments that we could look to find our values. I hope this was helpul to you. If it was helpful to you, please make sure to follow our podcast in any way you listen to this podcast. And if you're following us on YouTube, watching us on YouTube, make sure that you're also following and subscribing to the channel. We appreciate your support in any way. Like I said, we're looking to create and celebrate freedom for men. This is our podcast that also celebrates vulnerability, because we believe that vulnerability is the birthplace of everything good in the world. With that being said, thank you so much for tuning in this week. Goodbye for now.